Okay, well, our speaker today is Norman MacLean. Norman is Emeritus Professor of Genetics at Southampton University. He's a patron of Humanists UK, and he's also Deputy Chair of Southampton Humanists. And you may not know that Norman grew up as a member of the Exclusive Brethren, but at the age of 20, he was asked to leave the church for challenging the faith. So well done, Norman, for doing that. But it was only fairly recently, or in fairly recent years, that he identified as a humanist. And that was after attending a course on humanism at Southampton Humanists. And you can read more about his life story in the June edition of Humanistically Speaking, which is our regional humanist magazine, which you are all getting a copy of, I hope, and reading it from cover to cover. And Norman's latest book is called A Less Green and Pleasant Land, Our Threatened Wildlife. That was published a number of years ago. But he's got another one coming out next year, a book that he is editing, and it's going to look at the global situation for wildlife. So Norman is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open things up for questions and comments. So will you please give Norman a very warm welcome, if you know how to welcome him with the reactions button, or you can just raise your hands and clap in the normal way. So Norman, I'm going to unmute you now, and I'm going to spotlight you as well, so that we have the main focus on you. Let me just do that. Okay, Norman, so over to you.
Well, thank you. As David said, I'm currently editing a multi-author book which is entitled The Living Planet, The State of the World's Wildlife. And so I would like to share with you some of the ideas that have come out of editing that book. There are about 20 chapters and about 25 authors. I think the first thing to emphasize is where we are now. And where we are now is in the middle of a great extinction. But this, unlike previous extinctions, is caused by human activity. And it's been going on for about 10,000 years. If you think of our relationships on the plains of Africa where we evolved, people began to hunt other animals for food. And then I suppose one of the first extinctions were of the mammoths. And that was caused apparently by human activity, that people trapped them and fired arrows at them and brought them down for meat. And so the mammoths became extinct. And so this has been going on for a very long time. There's a rather good book which I would like to mention, which I'll hold up here. You can see it's called The Sixth Extinction, and it's written by an American lady called Elizabeth Colbert. So she did a lot of work on finding out what the state of play was right now and where the animals and plants were that were becoming extinct. Now, this is, of course, not the first extinction. The dinosaurs became extinct about 65 million years ago as a result of what seems to have been an asteroid plunging into what was then the Gulf of Mexico, or what has become the Gulf of Mexico. And their extinction was almost complete. The alligators and crocodiles were dinosaurs, and they've survived. And birds, which emerged from the dinosaurs, also survived. So there were survivors. But there have been previous extinctions before that. There was one which called the Permian Extinction, when the sea warmed up, and that led to about 90% of all the marine animals dying out. One of those marine animals, which was very plentiful then, was called a trilobite. And if I can hold up one here, there is a fossil trilobite, which came originally from Morocco. And at one time, these animals were very numerous, and they all became extinct during that great extinction in the Permian a few thousand years ago. So I thought we might just share together thoughts about how human activity is currently causing the decline of animals and plants. And there are about 8 factors which are important, many of which you'll be well aware of. So there are things like overfishing the oceans because of modern technology, which enables fishermen to see where the shoals of fish are. Deforestation, which is now widespread, the replacement of rainforest by, for example, oil palms, which is so evident in Indonesia. Agricultural intensification has been a major problem. You'll remember the book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, for which he was given the US Medal of Freedom. And in that book, she emphasized the destruction that DDT was causing. And so intensive farming involves the application of fertilizer and pesticides of different kinds. And that tends to result in a sort of monoculture, doesn't it? Where you end up with either a field of wheat and there are no weeds to be seen amongst the wheat, or if you're farming animals, often the animals are now farmed indoors rather than out of doors. So all of these factors are having an influence. Of course, our own population size has continued to increase, and so our imprint on the planet is very substantial. And that goes along with industrial spread, the spread of roads and railway systems, and the pollution that comes as a result of much of this. So we have polluted the planet in all kinds of ways. I sometimes say to myself that I'm not a very good humanist, because I know as a humanist, instead of placing faith in God, one tries to place faith in human activity and the way in which we're able to live our lives to the best ideals that we know. But of course, together with that, one has to recognize that our human activity is involved ownership of the planet, and we haven't made a very good job of that. And so I think we have to carry some responsibility for not having taken that more seriously. What I would like to do now is just to go back in time and think about the evolution of life on Earth. Life on Earth evolved very soon after the conditions on Earth permitted it to evolve. That is, there was a lot of water and the temperature of the water was moderate. And whenever those conditions came about, then early bacteria seemed to have evolved, and they were the first organisms. Now, the original bacteria were what is now called anaerobic. That is, they didn't depend on oxygen, they depended on other gases for their metabolic activity. But a new class of bacteria very quickly evolved, and they were called cyanobacteria. And they were able to photosynthesize, just as plants do today. And that meant that they produced sugar and starch as a result of harnessing the activity of the sun, but also it meant that they gave off oxygen as a waste product. And that was the first time that oxygen became available on planet Earth. Now, the original organisms would have been killed by oxygen. They were anaerobic. But a new group of bacteria and other organisms then evolved which would use oxygen as a metabolic agent. And we, of course, now think of the whole Earth of animals and plants that are aerobic. They depend on oxygen. And so that's how life on Earth began. It began by being anaerobic, and then it changed. The other aspect that it would be interesting to think about is the way in which the land masses of the Earth evolved. You're probably all aware that at one time there were huge tectonic plates joined together, making multi-continental land masses. And one of these was called Gondwana land. And that consisted of Africa and India, Australia, South America, and these all belonged to Gondwana land. And what I'd like to do is just to share with you something that was on Gondwana land. And here, if you can see it, these are the flowers of Euchrifia, a shrub which is in flower right at the moment in my garden, and that's where I plucked these from. Now, why am I telling you about Euchrifia? Well, because it occurs now on the southern tip of South America and the southern tip of Australia. And that's known as a Gondwana land distribution. So it clearly existed in Gondwana land, and that's how it ended up in these two quite separate places, because it evolved on that supercontinental mass. So we can attribute a lot of the continental spread to an origin in Gondwana land. There was a more northern landmass as well as Gondwana land called Laurasia, and I'm not going to refer to that right now. We might now think about the present state of the planet and say, how many species of animals and plants are there that we share the planet with? It's almost impossible to include bacteria because there are millions, well, certainly many, many thousands of different species of bacteria. But if we ignore them and say how many species of plants and animals are there altogether, the answer is about 30 million. And most of those are insects. It's very difficult to determine how many insects there are because they're so numerous. But we've lived through a period of enormous insect decline. If you're as old as I am, and I'm now in my mid-80s, I can remember when I first learned to drive a car, that my car, like all others, was fitted with a little plastic device on the front of the bonnet to ensure that my windscreen was not spattered with insects. So it deflected the insects away from the windscreen. And when you came into a petrol station at that time, someone would come out with a pail of water and a brush, and they would brush all the insects off your windscreen because our windscreens were splattered with insects. Now that problem's gone away because of the enormous decline in insects, which has largely been brought about by the use of DDT. So many insects have declined. So out of the 30 million or so, the majority are insects. And we can, excuse me, we can see in that group of animals already a sharp decline. And I don't like giving talks which are overly negative, although I have to say that most of the story about the world's wildlife at the moment is a negative one. That is, there are many more declining species than there are species that are recovering or increasing in number. But let's look at the balance. So there are quite a few species that are declining as well as the insects. But on the positive side, there are now good stories about the recovery of whales, for example. During intensive whaling that was worldwide on the oceans of the world by many nations, much of that has stopped. The only nations that now carry out whaling activities, killing whales for meat and oil, are Japan and a little bit in Norway. And then in Greenland, the Inuit still are allowed to kill local whales for meat. But other than that, most of the activity in whaling has stopped. And that's led to a wonderful response by most species of whales so that they've now increased. And so whale watching has almost replaced whale killing. And if you were over in the States, you might make an expedition to the American West Coast and be taken out in a boat to witness the migration of the gray whale. Gray whales breed in the southwest part, the waters in the southwest part of the States, and then they migrate with their youngsters close to the coast. And people love going out in boats. And many of these gray whales have not only become acclimatized to people, they've actually seemed to enjoy the response and the activity. And so they come up close to the boats and people can stroke them. So there seems to be a reciprocal relationship between the grey whale and humans. So that's one of the really positive things that's going on, as instead of it all being decline. And there are some other aspects of good news. The tiger in India, which was almost poached to extinction until about 15 years ago, has recovered substantially, and now the number of tigers there is in the low thousands and is going up by a few hundred a year. So that's another example. And then we've also been able, through our own ingenuity, to reintroduce many animals and plants which were very rare. If you think of the stories about the release, the breeding and release of the Californian condor, of the Hawaiian goose. Some of you may know, you've probably been down at Slimbridge, and Slimbridge carried out the raising of large numbers of Hawaiian geese. The eggs were cultured under ordinary ducks. And then they took the young geese back to Hawaii, and so the Hawaiian goose is once more resident in Hawaii. And so reintroductions have been a great success, and you'll be well aware of the fact that red kites and white-tailed eagles are being restored throughout much of England, and they've just introduced a sea eagle recovery centre in the Isle of Wight. So I'm sure that if you go out with a pair of binoculars over the next year or two, you're likely to see these enormous flying barn doors, as we say, because they're so huge, coming over the south of England from the Isle of Wight. So there have been good stories. Another good story is an insect called the large blue butterfly. And a team of people tried to understand the reasons for its decline, because it was almost extinct. It occurred on the chalk downs of Dorset and parts of the West Country. And this team of people discovered that it was dependent in its life cycle on a species of ant, because the caterpillars, the larvae of the large blue, produced a substance that was attractive to ants. So ants would take them down into the ant hills. And there they fed on the ant pupae, so they became parasitic on the ants. But the ants tolerated them because they had the right kind of smell. And then eventually, when the pupa breaks out into a butterfly, the butterfly is born in the ant's nest and walks out. They found that a particular species of ant was very good at rearing large blues. And so they worked on releasing large blue caterpillars in it, because initially the large blue caterpillar feeds on plants and is then taken by ants into the anthill. And so they reintroduced them in areas where this ant species occurred. It's an interesting story of introduction, because at first they kept people out and the large blues didn't do particularly well. And they found they did much better if they let people in. And this was because the people trampled the grass, and it meant that the ground underneath the grass was warmer. And so the ant species, which was beneficial to the large blue, thrived much better. So they now allow people into these reserves, and the large blue has been a wonderful success. So there are good stories as well as bad stories. I mean, just to kind of do the balancing act on reintroductions, many reintroductions, as I say, have been good. And the red kite has been a substantial benefit. And so there are now, some of you may have red kites flying over your gardens, and many of my friends in northern Hampshire have them nesting if they have a big enough garden. But as well, there is a downside to reintroductions in that we have accidentally introduced harmful animals and plants across the world. And so, for example, New Zealand introduced possums from Australia, and they've turned out to be very destructive. Australia itself had already camels in Central Australia, which were introduced. And of course, there are rats and mice throughout the world which have come off ships and whatever, and they are often predatory on other animals. So one of the downsides of human activity has been the accidental reintroduction of animals and plants. I mean, if you go to New Zealand, you'll see the plant which we call gorse, the yellow, with yellow leguminous flowers. And in the summertime, it makes a snapping noise if you walk past, which is indicating the release of the seeds. But gorse has become a major problem in New Zealand. And there are now huge areas of New Zealand which have been taken over by gorse. And the same is true, there's a plant which some of you will be familiar with called the water hyacinth, which looks very beautiful and has purplish flowers, and it floats on the surface of the water. But it's become a terrible invasive weed over much of the world. And so canals and lakes and so on have been taken over by water hyacinth. One of the few animals that really enjoys it is the hippo. And so the hippos feed, fortunately, on water hyacinth. So what really I'm saying is that the present situation is a balance. Some things are doing well, many species are not doing well, and the hope is that in the future we'll take better care of the planet. We'll try to monitor our use of insecticides and herbicides and intensive agriculture, and hopefully the health of the other wildlife on the planet will improve. So I hope you found that of interest, and please now tell me which other things you would like me to comment on.
Thank you very much, Norman. You've only used up half of your allocated time, so there's, but anyway, that's okay.
Okay, well, I'll probably use up a bit on the discussion.
Yeah, that's fine. So, okay, so we can now start taking comments and questions for Norman. If people know how to, the easiest way to do it is to raise the blue hand, if you know how to do that from the participants tab. But I will also try to spot anyone who may be raising their hand in a physical manner. Norman, oh right, okay, yes, we've got Roger. Let's just go to you, Roger. Roger, could you try to unmute yourself? I don't seem to be able to do it from my end at the moment. Yep, go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, you mentioned the success in reintroducing the large blue butterfly, and you've talked about the red kite. These are two species which were barely considered endangered worldwide. Do you not think it would be better to have spent some more time on things which are worldwide in danger of extinction?
I do, and you maybe heard Chris Peckham say that very thing. He feels that a lot of conservation effort is focused on species which people are either find cuddly or beautiful, but they're not necessarily the major species in the world. And I think Chris Peckham is right, and you are right about that. You may know that the species that are doing poorly in this country at the moment are things like birds in forest and farmland. It seems that intensive farming has almost eliminated space for species like skylarks. And so there's a present effort to persuade farmers to leave strips in their fields of corn, which are free of corn, where skylarks might nest. And they're also trying to train the tractor drivers to spot areas where there might be skylark nests so that they can avoid them. And that seems to be reasonably successful. So yes, it is true that a lot of conservation effort has gone into species which maybe were the wrong initial choices. Of course, the African and Asian rhinos are in terrible trouble, and that was partly a result of the poaching of rhinos for the completely nonsensical idea that rhino horn will serve as an aphrodisiac. And so both the two species of African rhino, the so-called black and white rhinos, are endangered. The northern black rhino is in particular trouble in Africa, and the Asian rhino, which occurs in areas like lowland Nepal, is also in very small numbers. So rhinos are not doing at all well.
Okay, thank you.
I could maybe mention another thing that has just come to my mind, which turned out to be a very beneficial introduction. And that is you hear people talking about the possible introduction of wolves back into Scotland. And I think that that might happen in the next 20 years, but it certainly is not going to happen in the next few years because farmers are very worried about it. But the wolf was reintroduced to Yellowstone Park in America, where it had become extinct. And they introduced numbers of wolves, so that I think they introduced initially about 50. And that's turned out to be a very great success. They found that because the wolf is a major predator of deer, it's prevented the proliferation of the deer, and that's meant that a lot of the vegetation has recovered. So apparently the vegetation of Yellowstone Park has now gone back to a state that it was in 20 or 30 years ago as a result of the reintroduction of the wolf. So that seems to have been quite a sensible move. And so there are good stories like that.
Thank you, Norman. Okay, let's go to Richard. Richard, I'll try and unmute you, but sometimes it's better if you...
Oh, yeah, I think...
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Norman. I was just going to ask, actually, refer back to the red kite example, which is great to observe them. They're a very interesting bird to observe if you get the chance, actually.
Yeah.
But is there, just out of interest, is there any evidence that the resurgence of the red kite has impacted on other birds of prey? I think, I'm not an expert by any means, but I think I read that the resurgence of the buzzard in recent years has impacted on the kestrel. So I was just wondering if there was any...
Yes, that's a very interesting idea. I think that I'm not aware that any other species has suffered from the proliferation of red kites. There's been a certain amount of persecution of red kites by gamekeepers. And as you correctly say, a few species, I think as a result of a change in management, have recovered along with the red kite. And so the buzzard is now the population must be 4 or 5 times what it was 10 or 20 years ago. The kestrel is struggling a little bit, and I think that's partly because the edges of main roads, which used to have a lot of voles in them, are being managed differently, and the vole population is poorer than it once was. So the kestrel is struggling. On the other hand, the sparrowhawk, as you probably know, has recovered very well once it was realized that DDT was harming the egg. The egg shell was too thin, and a lot of the eggs broke because of the effect of DDT on the adults. And now that that's been reduced, birds like sparrowhawks have dramatically recovered. And I certainly see a sparrowhawk crossing my garden every other day. So they've benefited.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Norman, you mentioned the insects. I mean, I remember, as a child in the probably 60s and 70s with the car windscreens being covered in insects. Just playing devil's advocate for a moment. I mean, could you argue that actually in those days we had too many insects? So it's a good thing that they've been reduced.
Yeah, there is another side to the argument. There were certain areas, certainly, where you couldn't build houses because of the mosquitoes. And mosquitoes, of course, require water for their larvae to live in. but there are species that survive in marine saltwater pools as well as freshwater pools. And mosquito, you may know very well that malaria at one time was a major disease in the UK. And so its reduction is largely because there are fewer mosquitoes. But if we were overzealous about conserving insects, we might well find that mosquitoes staged a recovery and became once more a bit of a pest. Other common insects you probably know, David, are that have almost disappeared. The common housefly, as a result of the use of fly papers and the way in which we dispose of our rubbish, is now much rarer than it used to be. And it's been largely replaced by a species called the lesser housefly, which is smaller and is now commoner than the housefly once was. Probably, yeah, sorry, after you.
I was just going to say that's very interesting, because I've noticed this summer a lot of flies in our garden, but they appear to be green. They've got a sort of metallic green sheen to them.
That's right. I think they're relatives of blue bottles and are called green bottles, and they thrive on rubbish. Their larvae will feed on rotting meat and all kinds of things like that. Another aspect to many of these houseflies and blue bottles and things like that is that a number of them have larvae which are semi-parasitic. That is, if farmers keep sheep and the back of the sheep becomes soiled with feces from other sheep, then the blue bottles and green bottles will lay their eggs on that, and eventually the larvae burrow into the back of the sheep and begin consuming it from the outside. And so farmers have found this is something of a problem. So we have to monitor the abundance of green bottles and blue bottles fairly carefully. There are all kinds of swings and roundabouts. There's a common disease of cattle called summer mastitis, where the udders of the females become inflamed, especially the teats, and it means the calves can't suckle. And summer mastitis is carried by flies. And so now many farmers put ear tags in the cattle. So they'll stick an ear tag of permethrin, which is an insecticide. And that seems to work pretty well to control summer mastitis. But unfortunately, often cattle that are being reared near a river walk into the river, and they then contaminate the river with permethrin. And of course, it means that a lot of the flies that used to be abundant in fresh water and were fed on by fish are now quite rare because of the pollution caused by permethrin. Another source of that sort of pollution, which might interest some people, is that fence posts, if they're put in too near a river, and in flood times the water comes up and surrounds the fence posts. Fence posts contain powerful insecticides to ensure they're not eaten away by beetles. But of course, if the water laps on them, it means the water becomes contaminated. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Aaron in the chat. Aaron is saying, what are the top 5 animals requiring protection? I don't know if you can specify the top 5, Norman.
Well, it would certainly be, the people often talk about going to Africa to see the big 5. And I think those are the African buffalo, one of the African rhinos, the hippo, the elephant, and the lion. And I think these are often regarded as the big 5. And the ones that, lions are managed fairly carefully. Unfortunately, the present pandemic has not been very good for them because much of the control depended on tourism. And the money provided by tourism funded rangers who would patrol the areas where the lions were and ensure that they were not poached. But of course, during this pandemic, a lot of the tourist activity has diminished. And so there are concerns about how animals especially rhinos and elephant tusks, and animals that have components that people would like to sell, suffer a bit from human activity. So the African elephant is a bit on the cusp. It's now recognized that there are two species of African elephant. There's a small one which occurs mainly in rainforests that used to be assumed to be the same species as the one that roamed on the plains, although it's much smaller. But it's now appreciated that they're two distinct species.
Thank you, Norman. This one is from Simon Whipple, and Simon, this is kind of related back to the insects. So this crossed my mind earlier, actually. Simon is saying, what is the future for the midge, which is somewhat an unwelcome insect in northern Scotland?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I am of Scots origin, and I still have a little croft in the Isle of Skye. But I time my visits to try and ensure they don't coincide with the midges, which is mainly during July and August. As probably everybody knows, the larvae of the midge spend their time in wet ground, and then they emerge in these huge clouds. And when I used to go fishing in Scotland, I noticed that many of my fellow fishermen wore beekeepers' helmets over their heads in order to try and keep the midges at bay. So yeah, people are still trying to find ways of controlling midges which won't be too destructive to other insects. And that's a problem, isn't it? Try to control one insect species without harming a lot of others.
Mm. And Chris Smith in the chat, Chris keeps hens and she has to protect her hens from the green bottles. She's calling it fly strike. I've not heard of that. But,
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Phil. Phil, do you want to unmute yourself if you can, or I will?
You've done it. You've done it.
Yeah, good.
Yes, thanks. Well, I did have a question, but I got a different one now for Norman. You just told me about living on the Isle of Skye. So what I'd like to know is, when is a good time to visit the Isle of Skye when you don't have all those unpleasant insects? Because I was just inspired that I would really like to go there recently by watching something. What's a good season for visiting? I mean, I noticed, for example, that I thought I noticed that there weren't many insects around down here, much fewer than normal in the later part of the spring and the early part of the summer. In the garden, I was a bit worried about that because I was worried there wasn't pollination going on for my vegetables. But is there a good time when you can go to the north of Scotland and avoid have acceptable weather?
Yeah, the months of May and June. The trouble is it doesn't coincide with the school holidays, and so people who have small kids.
I'm not worried about that.
But May and June are in Skye, it's heaven on earth. There are no midges, and usually it's not too wet because the rainy season begins again in July. So May and June are wonderful, if you can possibly go.
Yes, well, I might try that. I'll go back. Can I go back to my original? I had a kind of a comment or a question, because you were talking about the fact that humans have affected the wildlife all over the world so much by our agriculture and population, and that we're now intervening and rewilding or introducing, saving individual species, and it sounds like we're sort of replacing one kind of inadvertent control of the environment by another, which is kind of planned, and I worry a bit about that, whether we know enough about how ecosystems interact and species interact to be able to do that safely, and whether it's storing up trouble by introducing other problems.
Well, I think that's very true. I mean, the present situation is one in which a type of conservation has replaced, or is trying to replace, the downside of intensive agriculture or cutting down woodland and so on. And we don't always get it right. I mean, you probably know the water vole has become quite rare as a result of the activity of animals like American mink. I belong to Greenpeace, but it sometimes does, some of its members do foolish things. And in years gone by, they released a lot of mink. And the mink then came to inhabit riversides and were very destructive of water voles. But now the good news is that otters have recovered, and otters seem to be, either they predate mink or the mink don't thrive while there are otters. So another page is turned, and the water vole is now doing better in areas where there are otters. We have a complicated relationship with foxes as well. The urban fox has been one of the great success stories, and quite a lot of people put out food for them. But of course, they can also be quite destructive in terms of chickens and birds and so on. So our relationship with the fox is a complicated one, but by and large, I think they've recovered very well, and it's quite nice. I had foxes out at the foot of my garden 2 or 3 years ago, and it was very nice to see the youngsters. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Phil. We've got another one from Aaron in the chat. Aaron, you're saying the UK is generally short of water in summer months. At some point, we may need to make more reservoirs. Will this be good for future wet species or bad for the ground that is submerged?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question. We're in a period of where the water supply from rain is diminishing as a result of climate change. And of course, I should have mentioned climate change as one of the major factors in which humans affect the life of animals and plants on Earth. And climate change seems, despite Donald Trump's views, seems to be substantially caused by human activity. And so as the climate has changed, some animals and plants prosper and others decline. And so it is true that what we have to try and do is a balancing act where we conserve not just the species that we like, but some of the species that we should tolerate. It's hard to get the European beaver has been a question and point. And a lot of farmers were very worried about the reintroduction of the European beaver. Some of that was because I think there was confusion, that people thought it behaved like the American beaver and made enormous dams, but the European beaver makes much smaller dams, and ecologists are convinced that it is beneficial, that it creates small pools and more. I mean, somebody was asking a moment ago about water and rain, and I think that one of the things we should be doing is planting young trees on hillsides. I think some of the result of some of the floods have been caused by the fact that the rain just washes off the hillsides. Whereas at one time, when there were a lot of bushes and trees on the hillsides, it was absorbed into the ground. And the same applies in towns, that there's so much hard standing instead of gardens that rainfall tends not to be absorbed by the ground, but runs into the sewage system and then causes floods when these go into the rivers. So there's a lot of balancing act has to be accomplished over, I think the question was whether reservoirs would be a benefit. And I think they can be a benefit. I mean, people enjoy sailing on them, and sometimes if they're permitted, swimming in them. Many years ago, I was a schoolmaster in Northampton for a year, and the lads at school had a sailing club on Pittsford Reservoir, which had been recently created. And that was an excellent place to sail. But also I noticed that species like grass snakes proliferated around, grass snakes very, very much like feeding on frogs. And so the grass snake population increased enormously around Pittsford Reservoir. And so some species do well as a result of the creation of reservoirs.
Okay, thank you. Roger, you've got another question. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just feel that there's a little bit too much optimism in the way we're discussing this. I mean, since 1500, according to, I did some research in advance of this talk, and since 1500, 270 species, full species of animals and birds have become extinct. And the International Union for Conservation of Nature has classified 225 bird species and 233 mammal species as critically endangered. Even things like the Sumatran rhinoceros, there's only a few dozen left in the world.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that I'm very pessimistic about the willingness of humanity to do anything about this in a systematic and coherent way.
Well, I'm glad you've said that, because maybe I was in danger of sounding too optimistic. I tried to, because it's so easy to be pessimistic, and the main story is one of pessimism, it's easy to try and tell the good stories rather than the poor ones. But the general story is one of decline and extinction. There is an organization that many of you will recognize through its activities called Iucn, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And actually most of the authors who've helped me to write this new book are involved with Iucn activity. Now it's Iucn, they have experts in every country, and it's they who give a grading to a species. So if the species is near to extinction, they're red listed, and they then will spend money on monitoring it and trying to either introduce more of them or try to conserve the ones that are left. So Iucn is heavily involved in trying to advise governments how to spend their money on conservation. I mean, the whole tone of conservation has changed over recent years. At one time, a conservation area was viewed as a place that was fenced off and people were not allowed in. It's gradually been realized that we desperately need the money that people will bring if they're allowed into conservation areas to see the species that are there. So there's much more of a tendency now, you can see this in Africa especially, to allow tourists and tourist vehicles access to the reserves so that their money can be used to fund the conservation activity. So I think your question is very appropriate. There's no doubt at all that the main trend is downwards, and many more species are becoming extinct than are actually doing well.
See, I don't think that people understand how many are critically endangered in the world.
Yes, I'm sure that was partly my objective in writing this book, which we've called The State of the World's Wildlife. And there's a chapter in the book on flowering plants and non-flowering plants and lower plants, and then on each group of animals. And I've tried to find an expert or experts to write each chapter. So there's a chapter on marine mammals and one on land mammals, one on reptiles, and so on and so forth, to try and indicate to people just how serious the problem is. And so you're absolutely right to emphasize, as you do, that the general story is not a good one.
I think my concern is that it's middle-class Americans, middle-class Westerners who read these books, and yet the people who are suffering from the predation sometimes of wild animals are ill-educated people living on the verge of poverty, and they have different priorities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's a serious problem because these books are bought either by scientists who want a work of reference, or they're bought by people who are interested in wildlife. But as you say, the people at the coal face whose activities impinge on many of these animal and plant species are actually not very likely to read the book. And so it's very, very difficult to know how to influence world progress in terms of the benefits for wildlife.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Let's go to Richard again. Richard, let's just unmute you or unmute yourself.
There we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, my question sort of just links in with what was being said, really. You know, in respect to the fact that a lot of the endangered animals that are linked to being illegally caught or killed for products, whatever they might be, to do with medicine or ivory and the whole range, or even, subsistence farmers having to grow drug crops, illegal drug crops to make actually a cash.
Yes.
It's a sort of socio-economic factor that, I completely disagree with all that activity, but it's kind of understandable. Somebody living in a real subsistence situation where they have apparently no hope of generating a cash crop or of some sort, almost, effectively forced into that by socioeconomic circumstances, however terrible it is. And obviously some are carrying out, more aggressively illegal things, and other ones are, doing some more passively things. But there is that big, that big inequality and prosperity. It's almost kind of understandable that they might turn.
When I was an active geneticist, I made a number of trips to China, and I collaborated with a number of people in Chinese laboratories. But that revealed a lot of things to me about China. I mean, anything that moves is eaten in China, and the ordinary people will go out and they'll buy turtles and tortoises and lizards and all manner of things to take home and eat, because of course they're often very hungry and they haven't got a lot else to eat. So there is a major problem in countries like China and India with a large population of relatively poor people, because these people, the activities of these people seeking food and water is often very destructive of the wildlife. And if I can just mention something else in that connection, people interested in birds are increasingly worried about many of our migratory birds which fly into Africa for the winter. And when they come back, we find their numbers are diminished. And some of this is due to the problems in an area called the Sahel, which is just south of Morocco. There's a very large area, and it's a river, the Niger River, flows through it. But there's much more intensive agriculture now in the Sahel than there was 10 or 20 years ago. And many of the birds that migrate into that area either spend the winter there or they pass through it during their migration. And they suffer a great deal now from lack of food because they can't find the insects they're looking for. So conservation has become a kind of world management problem about how to persuade other nations to do things somewhat differently. And that's a very difficult thing to do, I think. I mean, another thing that many of you will have read about are the effect of the wildfires in Australia, which I suppose were exacerbated, to say the least, by global warming. And Australia, during the past 2 years, has had the worst wildfires on record. And the number of animals, I think the last count I saw was 3 billion animals had died in the wildfires of Australia. So fire is a real problem to the Australians, and they don't really know how to control it. Of course, increased desertification has often resulted from human activity, and I think this is to some extent true in Australia.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Aaron's popped another one in the chat. Aaron is saying, if we were able to observe a mirror planet to Earth without humans, would species not develop and die off as a natural outcome of life?
Well, that's certainly true. If you consider all the species that have occurred on planet Earth, a tiny number of them exist today. So there are many, many more species have died out on planet Earth than are currently living. And to some extent, that is a result of a result of the ordinary activity of evolution, that the animals and plants are competing together, and the unsuccessful species have been outcompeted by other species. And so Darwin got it right that animals are involved in a struggle for existence, and many species disappear not through human activity, but simply because they can't cope with the other species that are competing with them. And that's gone on time out of mind. And certainly there have been a huge number of species that lived on planet Earth that are no longer alive. So if we were able to visit another planet that had no humans on it, we would find a similar situation, I guess, in that although there might not be the dreadful and rapid declines that we've seen here in recent years, there would nonetheless be an evolution going on where some species prospered and others declined.
Okay, thank you. Norman, I don't know if you have an answer to this one. I'm wondering if it's possible or might become possible in the future to resurrect extinct animals from DNA.
Yes, that's a complicated question, David, although it's a very interesting question, because those of you who went to the cinema to see Jurassic Park or films like that will have realized that there was a suggestion that you could recover DNA from fossil material and maybe resurrect an animal. Now, the straight answer to it is no, you cannot do that, because you need to recover a cell rather than just the DNA. But there's a roundabout way in which you can recover an egg from a related species and replace its DNA. Say you wanted to make a mammoth, and that's an activity which is going on at the moment, where you find that mammoths whose tissues have been preserved in the extreme cold of the Arctic, you can actually get DNA, very good quality DNA from them, and you can reintroduce that into the eggs of an elephant and try and then put the fetus back in an elephant and have it reared so that it would turn out to be a mammoth. And there are a few examples of that, other than the mammoths. So there are kind of long ways round. They all involve fairly elaborate science, rather akin to Dolly the sheep, where you've got to play around with the DNA and the nucleus. In fact, it allows me, David, to say that one of the mysteries still about the evolution of life on Earth is where the cell nucleus came from, because bacteria have no nuclei, whereas we all have DNA in chromosomes, and the chromosomes exist in our nuclei. But nobody has any idea how the nucleus evolved, and of course nobody has ever been able to recreate it. We can't get life to re-evolve in the test tube. So it remains a bit of a mystery. Yeah.
Okay, fascinating possibilities for the future, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring Aaron in live, as it were. So, Aaron, go ahead.
Right, yes, my washing machine has finished making lots of noise now.
Oh, yeah, I wondered why you were putting everything in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you, Norman. I'm just wondering that once we all become vegetarians and stop farming animals, is there a risk that even regular animals like pigs and cattle and stuff will die off, or only be visible in zoos and things like that?
Well, that's entirely possible. I don't know if you read that book called Sapiens, written by the Israeli guy, but he's convinced that we should all become vegetarian because he thinks that farming animals is cruel. I don't know whether Israeli farmers are more hard on their livestock than British farmers, but my impression is that on a lot of farms, the cattle are relatively happy until they go to the abattoir, as it were. But that's his view, that we should be increasingly vegetarian. And of course, if a lot of us became vegetarian, then our dependence on cattle and sheep might reduce markedly. And so they might come to be replaced. I mean, farmers have always got to be experimental, and they're currently trying to grow species of deer and llamas and so on, instead of cattle and sheep. And I think there's a lot of concern the pandemic has not been an easy time for farmers, and people who trade in meat or wool are having difficulty marketing it. And so I think this period has been a considerable trial to lots of people who had a way of life carved out for them, only to find that over the past 6 months, they can't actually make the money anymore.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm a big meat eater myself, but I do want to get to the stage where we can have lab-grown meat so that we don't have to kill anything to get there. But it does raise the question of what will happen to all the animals.
Yes. I mean, I think that it could be that the size of cattle and the herds of cattle and flocks of sheep will diminish. And of course, there would be plenty of wild species who would be quite glad to fill their place. So if we made space, I mean, that's been one of the problems with agriculture, that there's so little land left for wildlife, because most of the land is taken up either for growing crops or for farming cattle or sheep. And any change in that, I think, would be good for wildlife. I mean, another positive thing you're maybe aware of is that farmers have been encouraged to try to counteract the fact that they no longer grow spring wheat. So they sow it in the winter, and it means they don't have stubble. And the stubble used to be a wonderful reservoir of seed for numerous small birds. And in order to compensate for the lack of stubble, farmers are now being increased to put out waste seed as food for birds in some area of land which was unimportant to them. And I think that's a very good idea. It seems to me that a lot of birds would benefit, who used to benefit from the stubble.
Okay.
I mean, it's a picture, isn't it, where many species come and go. I mean, a lot of the species that we've become familiar with, greenfinches, corn buntings, chaffinches, many of these species were probably once rare, and they became common because of agriculture. And now that agriculture is becoming more intensive, they're declining again. So it's a kind of swings and roundabouts situation.
Okay.
Just as a follow-up question to that, Norman, I saw a YouTube video some time ago that suggested that we actually need cattle in order to, we need cattle dung on the land in order to sort of generate soil. I don't know if how important that is in terms of soil creation, having cattle.
Yes, it is. A lot of our wildlife are dependent on cattle dung. But of course, what's happening now, because cattle are often treated with insecticides, the dung fly that used to be so common and was predated by birds like starlings has now become rare because the dung is sterile. And so you've got these swings and roundabout situation where the starling has declined as a result of treating cattle with insecticidal material. But yeah, I think that on the whole, the dung is beneficial. And if you go to a country like Portugal or Spain, where in many areas the cattle are ranched, and so they're free to roam, you find that there's a large ecological community dependent on the cattle dung. So there are beetles and flies and all manner of things which depend on it and have a way of life which involves an ability to capitalize on cattle dung. And I mean, another species that's problematic at the moment is the vulture. We didn't talk about that, but I maybe should revert to the fact that about the decline of vultures in India due to the availability of animal carcasses that were infected with something that's actually just like Vulturol. But this turns out to be toxic to vultures, and so there's been an enormous decline in the populations of vultures in India. And that is spread also to Europe. So the European griffon vulture is affected by these problems. So it just tells us once more how we've got to perform this balancing act of looking at the effects of our activities.
Thank you. Let's bring Roger in again. Roger, do you have another question for Norman?
Yeah, I mean, I find it quite difficult to know how to respond to the question. I was talking to somebody the other day about this issue, about the extent to which species are going extinct. And the person said, well, why does it matter? I can talk a little bit in terms of ecology and the relationship of one species to another, but why should I care if pandas go extinct?
Well, I mean, the short answer to that is that we are not alone on the planet, that we share the planet with other species. And we do tend to be an acquisitive and somewhat arrogant species, and we tend to assume that planet Earth is here for our convenience, and that none of the other species are of consequence unless they're important to us. But to me, I think that's a very short-sighted view. Not only are we dependent on other animal and plant species as in agriculture, but I think we have a moral right, a moral obligation to encourage wildlife to thrive, simply because they're present on the planet. We are not the only life form here. And I think you can judge human nature and human activity in terms of its ability or interest in helping to conserve other species.
Well, I think so too, but I'm struggling to find an objective reason other than my personal feelings.
Well, that's right. That's part of our dilemma, that we tend to think that our feelings are paramount. And if we want something to happen, then it should happen. And if it doesn't interest us, then it doesn't matter. But I think we have to educate ourselves to say, look, we have a moral obligation to the other species with which we share the planet. And we also have an obligation to ourselves because the decline of other species does have ramifications for our own farming, forestry, and fishing activity. So I think Darwin was right that we are in a situation where we are to some extent dependent on other species. And if we allow too many of them to disappear, our way of life will suffer. But of course, it is also true that many humans are so demanding on the planet. The man who has a huge yacht and a private aeroplane wants to have 2 yachts and 2 airplanes. And so there is a human activity which is very selfish and undesirable in terms of how we treat the planet. And some people just don't care. All they're interested in is their own pleasure. And I don't know how to change that.
And many people are very cut off from nature, aren't they, Norman, living in towns and cities? Lots of people, I guess, are not really aware of what's beyond the city and the town.
That's right. I mean, curiously enough, this period of the coronavirus pandemic has probably improved people's relationships. Many people say that during the pandemic, their mental health has improved when they've been out in gardens or taken a walk in the countryside. And it's made them realize that they're dependent on these things for a feeling of happiness rather than a feeling of depression. So I think there is a positive benefit. And some of you may have listened to, there's a man called David Goulson who has a chair at the University of Sussex. And he's got quite a large garden. And he was on Gardener's World recently talking about his garden and how he's allowed a lot of it to go wild in order to encourage insects to come in and occupy niches in his garden which they wouldn't otherwise do. And I think many other people during this lockdown have become aware of how pleasing it is to have a walk in the countryside. In fact, I've noticed, because I'm quite a keen gardener, that I've been ordering plants during the pandemic. And one group of people who thrived during this period are people who sell plants mail order. If you write to them and say, I would like to put in this order, they write back and they say, I'm sorry, it'll be a few months before I can deal with it because I've got so many orders. So they seem to have done very well at it.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let's bring Richard in again. Richard.
Okay, I'm muted, yeah. I just want to offer a couple of reassurances, really. Not that I'm an expert, but first, I'm also looking forward to the time when, which isn't too far, I don't think, with the artificially created fish protein or, insect protein substitutes for meat. But Erin was asking about, for instance, farm animal breeds, antique or heritage farm animal breeds. I think there are reassuringly plenty of people in farm parks enthusiasts who enjoy keeping those breeds going, antique breeds, for people to see, a bit like a zoo. Also, even if you look at all the hundreds of varieties of heritage apples, which have no sort of apparent commercial value now, but very often if you go to botanical gardens in October, they very often have apple days when they'll have hundreds of different apple varieties that are enthusiasts keep growing from the past, going back, even hundreds of years maybe. So there will always be enthusiasts who, love to keep those sort of things going, I think.
Yes, I quite often watch Countryfile, and the main farmer on Countryfile is an enthusiast for rare breeds, as his father was. And one of the pleasures of watching Countryfile is to see how he's managed to develop herds and flocks of some of these rare breeds, which is rather nice.
And you can see his love and enthusiasm and passion for that is quite absolutely apparent, isn't it?
It is.
But I mean, he's also a commercial farmer as well, but he has that, sort of interest as well. I was going to say about, Roger's point, just going back specifically to the panda, I think, if you're an ultra rationalist, it might be difficult to say what can a panda, what value is a panda to us. But I think materially you can say this because it constitutes inspiration to a lot of people. Even soft toy manufacturing, plastic zoo animal toy manufacturing, probably children's stories, posters. It actually generates a massive economy in itself. That's just the panda, probably a tiger, all the other sort of creatures.
Yes, it does.
So the actual source of inspiration and creativity they provide, rather than direct material economic value, let's say, secondary economic value, it's absolutely tremendous, I think. So that's quite an easy one. I can understand that sort of challenge.
Yeah,
it's quite easy.
Well, it's a very good example. I mean, don't you agree? I mean, the giant panda is an animal that doesn't deserve to survive in terms of its ecology. The female is only receptive for a few days in the year, and if the males don't hang around on those few days, she won't be fertilized, and then she has to go into a burrow somewhere in order to rear this tiny panda, which is born somewhat prematurely. And of course, they're dependent for food on one or two species of bamboo, and these bamboos are what are called monocarpic. So they all flower at the same time, and after flowering, they die. And so even its food supply is in constant danger of becoming extinct. And so I think without human activity, pandas would rapidly diminish and disappear. But as you say, culturally, the giant panda has been of enormous interest to us. Children like to have pandas, and women like to knit black and white pandas. So its influence on our culture is substantial and out of all proportion to the numbers in nature.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Chris Smith. Chris.
Thank you for the talk, and the questions are also very interesting. Some time ago, in my head, I heard somebody saying that one of the reasons hedgehogs have declined is because there's no longer a lot, well, there's still plenty, dog poo about, because hedgehogs would eat dog poo and get some nutrition, because especially if dogs are fed on meat. Now, I don't know whether that was true or false, but you know, every action seems to have a consequence.
Yes.
And has the bagging of dog poo actually done harm anywhere along the line?
I've never heard that story before, so I have no idea whether hedgehogs would eat dog poo. But I can believe that they would recover some benefit from doing so. I mean, there are lots of animals in the world that feed on the poo of other animals because there's still nutrients left in it. So that might well be the case. I can maybe sneak in the comment, but although the hedgehog is doing badly, partly because the badger over much of the UK is doing rather well. And the great enemy of the hedgehog is the badger, because badgers turn them upside down and bite them on the underside and then devour them. And almost no other animals is able to tackle a hedgehog. In my area of Southampton, hedgehogs are very numerous. I put out food for them at night, and I've got at least 4 that come every night. And I know my neighbours on the other side of the road have a similar experience. There's a guy there with a little camera which he sets up at night, and he monitors the movement of hedgehogs through his garden. And again, he tells me there's 5 or 6 of them. So in local areas, they seem to be doing quite well. But I gather that nationally, they're doing very poorly. And of course, you probably know that, again, one of the flip sides of this is that hedgehogs were introduced to the Outer Hebrides, and they've turned out to be a bit of a pest because parts of the Hebrides have an ecosystem called the Macaire, which is sandy soil with lots of beautiful wildflowers in it. And there are quite a number of wading birds that nest in the Macaire. But the hedgehogs are now proliferating there, and they go through the Macaire and eat the birds' eggs. So they're now trying to round up the hedgehogs in these islands and get rid of them by bringing them back to the mainland. So it's a curious conservation activity.
Well, I haven't seen a hedgehog for many years, Norman, so it's lovely to know that you still have some visiting hedgehogs.
Yeah, I have a nightly vigil when I go out to watch them.
Oh, that's lovely to know. Norman, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon. I wondered if you wanted to just finish off by saying 1 or 2 things about what we could do as individuals, apart from buying your books, that is.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've enjoyed, I've never given a talk on Zoom before, and I'm not very adept at doing it. So I apologize for my difficulties. But yes, I mean, as you can probably sense, although I think that the story worldwide for wildlife is not a very cheerful one, I think there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. And I think that as well as some people being rather selfish in their way of life and not being concerned about other wildlife, I think that in the main, in civilized countries and cultured countries, interest in wildlife is increasing. And this will mean that people will tend to garden differently and farm differently, and will treat the rainforest differently. So I think there are lots of reasons to be hopeful for the future.
Mm. That's lovely to end on a note of optimism. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Okay, well, yes, if you'd like to show your appreciation for Norman, I've received lots of clapping symbols going up and people are clapping silently. But thank you again, Norman.